Welcome back, U.S. History students. We are going to finish up Chapter 15, Section 4. This begins on page 493, and we've got a lot to cover in this section that's pretty important. So let's get started. You remember in 1858, a lot of different things happened. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, in 1857, the Dred Scott ruling. In 1858, something else happened. A man named John Brown, and you probably remember him from Bleeding Kansas, he tried to start an uprising. His idea was that he was going to attack a federal arsenal in Virginia and seize the weapons there. Then he was going to arm local slaves. His plan was to kill or take hostage white Southerners who stood in his way, and he collected money from white abolitionists to support the army, but after 2 years, he only had about 20 men. Nonetheless, that didn't stop him. On October 16th, 1859, John Brown's raid began. John Brown's raid began. He and his men took over the arsenal in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. VA is the abbreviation for the state of Virginia. His hope was, what he wanted to do was start a slave rebellion. However, it didn't work the way he wanted it to. He had sent some of his men into the surrounding countryside to try and get slaves to join him, but they didn't come. The slaves around Harper's Ferry were afraid of being punished if they took part, and so local white Southerners attacked John Brown and his men. 8 of his men and 3 local men were killed. Brown and some of his other men retreated to a firehouse. Federal troops arrive in Harper's Ferry the next night. The very next morning, the man who was in charge of them ordered a squad of Marines to storm the firehouse. That man was Colonel Robert E. Lee. You're going to need to remember his name for the next chapter because he becomes very important. Some of you, I'm sure, know a little bit about the Civil War already and know who he is. Robert E. Lee ordered the group of Marines to storm the firehouse. They killed 2 more of Brown's men and captured all of the rest of the men, including John Brown. If you look on page 494, you can see a picture of John Brown, a photograph of him. And here is another primary source, John Brown's last speech. He was convicted of treason. He was convicted of murder. He was convicted of conspiracy. Some of his men received death sentences. A man named John A. Copeland, who was a fugitive slave, defended him. Defended his own actions. In fact, what he said was, if I'm dying for freedom, I couldn't die for a better cause. John Brown was convinced that he would be sentenced to death, and so he delivered a speech, and you can read part of that there. But he says, I intended certainly to have made a clean thing of that matter. I never did intend murder or treason, or the destruction of property, or to excite or incite the slaves to rebellion, or to make insurrection. Had I interfered in the matter which I admit in behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, it would have been all right, and every man in this court would have been deemed it an act worthy of reward rather than punishment. I believe that to have interfered as I have done in behalf of his, and he means God there, his despised poor is no wrong, but right. And he also said, now if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice and mingle my blood with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, then I say let it be done. He believed that what he had done was for a greater and a nobler cause. The judge ordered him to be hanged, and it was carried out on December 2nd, 1859. Many Northerners really mourned the death of John Brown, but there were some abolitionists who actually criticized his actions as too extreme. Abraham Lincoln said that Brown agreed with us in thinking slavery wrong. That cannot excuse violence, bloodshed, and treason. Many abolitionists wanted slavery to be abolished with more peaceful means, if at all possible. Southern whites, slaveholders, and non-slaveholders felt very threatened by John Brown, as you can imagine. They were worried about another attack, sort of a copycat attack. In fact, there was a South Carolina newspaper that said, "We are convinced the safety of the South lies only outside the present Union." Another newspaper said, "The sooner we get out of the Union, the better." Oh boy. The election of 1860. Now, on your test, you are going to have an essay question. And you are going to have to write me a couple of paragraphs about why the election of 1860 is important. So listen up, pay attention. The election of 1860 was run in a nationwide climate of distrust. Okay? The Northern and Southern Democrats were disagreeing with each other on a candidate. Northern Democrats chose Stephen Douglas. Southern Democrats backed John C. Breckinridge. John C. Breckinridge. John C. Breckinridge was from Kentucky. He supported slavery in the territories. Now there's a new political party coming up, and that is the Constitutional Union Party. The Constitutional Union Party's premise was that no political principles other than the Constitution of the country, the Union of States, and the enforcement of the laws. This new party, they met in Baltimore, Maryland, and they selected John Bell as their candidate. Okay? So John C. Breckinridge was the candidate of the Southern Democrats. Stephen Douglas was the candidate of the Northern Democrats. John Bell was the candidate of the Constitutional Union Party. Who are the Republicans going to pick? Well, at first, William Seward was their choice. He was a senator from New York, but it turned out that Abraham Lincoln held more appeal for these party members. Lincoln was known as a moderate. He was against the spread of slavery, but he had actually promised not to abolish slavery where it already existed. Douglas, Breckinridge, and Bell all knew that they might not win the election. They were just hoping for enough electoral votes to keep Lincoln from winning in the Electoral College. But the Republican Party was unified behind Lincoln, and he won. He received the highest number of votes out of the four candidates, but he actually only received 40% of the overall vote, so he didn't receive a majority. He had 40, the other three had 60, but that 60% was divided three ways. Lincoln won. He won 100 of 183 electoral votes in free states. Douglas had the second highest number of popular votes, but he only won one state, so he only had electoral votes for one state, 12 electoral votes. Breckinridge and Bell split them in the other slave states. If you look at the map on page 495 in your book, and I invite you to pause me, get your book out. If you don't have it out, you should, and turn to page 495 and look at this map. You can see the states that voted for Lincoln, the state that voted for Douglas, the states that voted for Breckinridge, and the states that voted for Bell. Remember that electoral votes are based on how many representatives a state has in the U.S. House of Representatives. And now Texas and California have are two of the three largest representatives in the Electoral College and in the U.S. House of Representatives. But back then they were frontier states. They didn't have as many people, so they didn't have as many votes. Now, these election results made Southerners mad. Oh, they were, as we say down south, ready to spit nails. Lincoln didn't campaign in the South, and he did not carry a single Southern state. But he became the next president. And this election signaled that the South was losing its power. Now, Lincoln absolutely insisted that he would not change slavery in the South. But he said that slavery could not expand, and because it couldn't expand, it would eventually die out. And that made a lot of Southerners really, really mad. People in the South believed that their economy would absolutely collapse without slavery. And, I mean, they weren't wrong completely. But they also believed that their way of life would be destroyed. And they were actually kind of wrong about that, because a lot of the good things about the Southern way of life have continued to be true down there. But their economy didn't do so hot after the Civil War, and hopefully we'll get to that. But this was really upsetting to them. This was really angering to them, and they reacted absolutely immediately. Within a week of Lincoln's election, South Carolina called for a special convention, and they talked about the idea of secession. Now, you know, to secede means to leave the Union. They believed that they had a right to leave the Union because they had voluntarily joined the Union. So they could leave by the same process, right? That was their thought. Critics argued that this was silly. This was ridiculous. President Buchanan said the Union wasn't a voluntary association of states to be dissolved at pleasure by any one of the contracting parties. President Lincoln agreed, saying, "No state upon its own mere motion can lawfully get out of the Union. They can only do so against the law and by revolution." So, the South Carolina representatives were meeting in Charleston to talk about secession. Congress is trying to figure out how to save the Union. There was a senator named John J. Crittenden of Kentucky. Now, some of you have already done your quizzes, and you may have noticed that on the quizzes he's written as John C. Crittenden. One of the questions, it should read John C. Breckinridge, and the other one, it should read John J. Crittenden. That is a typo on the part of the textbook publisher. So be sure when you look at those questions to make sure you're reading the context correctly. John Crittenden was from Kentucky, and he proposed a series of amendments that he thought would satisfy the South. He wanted to avoid secession. He wanted to avoid civil war. Lincoln didn't like Crittenden's plan. Lincoln believed that we could not compromise on the spread of slavery. So we cannot do that. Lincoln said the tug has to come, and better now than later. There was a Senate committee. Every Republican rejected it, as Lincoln requested they do. At that point, South Carolina elected to dissolve the union now subsisting between South Carolina and the other states. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union. You will find this on page 497. The other states that seceded were Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, and they formed the Confederate States of America. The Confederate States of America. Now, you may remember was it section 1? Yes. Section 1, we talked about Jefferson Davis. You need to go back to your notes in section 1 on your study guide, and you need to write down that the Confederate States elected Jefferson Davis of Mississippi as their president. He became president of the Confederate States of America. He actually had wanted to be the commanding general of Mississippi. He wasn't happy about being elected, and if you are able to watch any of Ken Burns's documentary on the Civil War, which is extraordinarily long, I actually own it. If anybody wants to borrow it, come and see me, send me an email, let me know. It's 8 hours long, but it's well worth your time if you happen to have 8 hours to blow. But a lot of Jefferson Davis's writings his letters, his diaries were preserved, and they give a lot of insight into how he was feeling. When the Southern states seceded, there was a question. Who owns federal property in the South? Right? Because you've got federal courthouses. The United States government has property in the South. Who owns it? The forts in Charleston, South Carolina were federal property. However, Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy said, well, they were ready to defend those properties. They were ready to keep the Federal Army from controlling. So, Lincoln takes office. Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4th, 1861. As he was trying to write his inaugural address, he was rereading some of the founding documents, and he went back to this idea that a government receives its just powers from the consent of the governed. You'll remember that from the Declaration of Independence. And what Lincoln said was, this country, with its institutions, belongs to the people who inhabit it. Whenever they grow weary of the existing government, they can exercise their constitutional right of amending it or their revolutionary right to dismember or overthrow it. I cannot be ignorant of the fact that many worthy and patriotic citizens are desirous of having the national constitution amended. Another thing that Abraham Lincoln said, and this is one of my favorite quotes by him, is he said that an idea, whether well or ill-founded, cannot be ignored. That's kind of a paraphrase. But basically, what he's saying is if you've got this popular idea, whether you think it's right or wrong, if it's popular, you can't ignore it. You have to address it. He believed that U.S. citizens had the power to change their government through majority consent, but he opposed the idea that the Southern states could just leave because they were unhappy. In his inaugural address, he said that he was going to keep all government property in the seceding states, but he also tried to convince the Southerners that he was not going to provoke a war. His hope was that if we gave them a little time, let them cool off, they would come back to the Union, and we know what happened next. So that is the end of chapter 15. We're going to finish this up, turn in your quizzes, and we'll take our tests early next week, and then we'll start on chapter 16, the Civil War. My hope is to actually do 16 and 17, but at the very least we will cover chapter 16 and we'll talk about the Civil War and what happens when our nation breaks apart and then comes back together again. Have a great weekend, guys.